We are going to talk about marine life today, starting with a brief look at Aristotle, who's considered the father of marine biology, and then ending with the extraordinary drawings of a controversial figure. So we know that Aristotle wrote a lot about nature in general. He was surrounded by water, and about 20% of his writings on nature were on marine life. He wrote about anatomy and their behavior, as well as their relationships between species, such as symbiotic or predator and prey relationships, their competition for resources, the diseases, development, and reproduction, especially of dolphins. He noted the difference between salt and freshwater species and divided marine animals by their reproductive traits, such as live birth versus eggs, which would be called viviparous or oviparous. So he's generally considered the father of marine biology. But since we're focusing on art in this class, we'll jump ahead several hundreds of years to the 16th century, the beginning of 16th century, when more attention was paid to marine life than terrestrial creatures. So we're looking here at the work of Guillaume Rondelay, born in 1507. Rondelay was a French naturalist who began with the study of medicine and worked briefly at a medical practice before focusing his studies on fish. After a failed stint as a physician, he managed to be employed as the personal physician to Cardinal Tournon of France and traveled with the cardinal's entourage throughout France, Belgium, and Italy, which allowed him to make the acquaintance of other naturalists, such as Aldrovandi, who we discussed in the zoology section and the collections sections, and many others, and this helped him pursue his interest in natural history. He wrote a book called The Book of Marine Fish, in which he described around 250 aquatic species, which also included mammals and invertebrates. So anything living in the water fell into the broad category of fish at the beginning of the 16th century. The specimens were usually collected for him by fishermen, and then the illustrations were done from life, which meant that the colors would be changing as the fish dried up. Modern ichthyologists claim that his illustrations are, with the exception of the imaginary creatures, accurate and reliable, although the coloring is not. The shapes and the details of the scales and gills and so forth are still considered reliable. Rondelay dissected specimens to study their organs, and like his contemporaries, he made no distinction between anything living in the sea, although he did note the similarities between dolphins, pigs, and mammals, and so recognized dolphins as mammals. His study of the sea urchin is one of the first known examinations of an invertebrate after Aristotle. So a long gap between ancient Greece and the Renaissance. He included this image of the bishop's fish, which is a specimen that was supposedly found in the sea between Denmark and Sweden in the 1540s. This creature was said to have a projection similar to a bishop's mitre on its head and a face like a human's, with limbs resembling claws in the place of pectoral fins and tail fins that resembled legs. This tale is thought to have origins in the sighting of a giant squid in the water between Denmark and Sweden. Rondelay's illustration was based on an image that he'd seen in Rome of a sea monster and on a persistent rumor that this creature had been carried to the king of Poland, where it expressed its desire to return to the water and then was set free. So we see here the mixing of fact and fiction included in these books of natural history. Rondelay's work was taken at face value for 100 years, and we see different iterations of this bishop's fish repeated in multiple books and in prints in the next century. This is the work of Pierre Bellon, born just 10 years later, who wrote a book called The Nature and Diversity of Fish, which included the descriptions of things that live in the water. All of them were considered fish, and which included also mythical creatures, as well as water rats, crocodiles, and hippos. Bellon included the name of every specimen, or of every species rather, in Latin, Greek, English, and French. These woodcut illustrations are attributed to Pierre Gordel. Bellon began as an apothecary and then studied botany, then traveled in order to collect specimens and to observe the natural world. He studied with the botanist Valerius Cordus in Germany, who encouraged his students to make their own observations rather than relying on the work of others and repeating it. We're looking here at Bellon's version of the bishop's fish on the left. He was sent on a diplomatic mission with about 30 others by the King of France to the Eastern Mediterranean, which was then under the control of the Ottoman Turks. He spent 3 years traveling through Greece, the Asia Minor, Palestine, Arabia, Egypt, and Italy, documenting firsthand accounts of the flora and fauna, as well as the people of these places and their historic landmarks. He broke with the tradition of writing about nature from a religious or moralizing approach and tried to adhere to objective descriptions, although he did include some imaginary creatures, quite possibly at the insistence of the publisher, who thought it would help sell more copies of his books. His book, called The Nature and Diversity of Fish, was published in 1551 and covered all creatures living in the water. Very few of these images and descriptions are of fish in the modern sense. He did make some important observations, though, which included the fact that dolphins shared in common with land mammals their air-breathing lungs, mammary glands, a four-chambered heart, and placenta. And Bellon also developed a classification of sea animals based on the anatomy of the spine and of their abdominal organs, which is still used by marine biologists. Conrad Gessner, born in 1516, so just a year before Bellon, was an enormously ambitious and prolific writer and is considered the father of modern zoology. We looked at some of his work last week. He wrote or edited around 70 books. By the time he was 21, he'd published a Latin and Greek dictionary, the first of his kind. He wrote the first ever bibliography, which included the name of every known book and author. And he attempted to compile an encyclopedia of every known language, although he was only aware of 300 languages out of approximately 7,000 languages that existed at that time. Many hundreds have been lost. Gessner compiled the first book on modern zoology. He was a physician and professor of medicine in Greek and wrote the 5-volume compendium called Historia Animalium, which was a comprehensive scientific treatment of animals that compiled knowledge from the Roman Empire, which, as we've discussed, was then translated into Arabic and then Latin, and then added his own firsthand observations. He included descriptions taken from Greek, Roman, and Hebrew sources, and added descriptions of birds, mammals, fish, plants, and more that he collected from a network of scholars throughout Europe. He then spent many years cross-checking descriptions submitted by various scholars and tried to confirm and compile the information. When illustrations of a species in his book weren't available, he drew them himself. While Bellon's book on fish covered 450 species, Gessner added another 300 for a total of over 700 descriptions of marine life. He included details of each species' physical appearance, details on their habits and habitat, and their nomenclature, which would vary by region. It also varied by their use in medicine and by their place in literature. He included mythological creatures and well-known but erroneous depictions of actual creatures to discuss their origins. So, for example, he described the origins of the mermaid. This is the work of Wenceslas Haller, who was a prolific illustrator that worked for multiple artists and publishers in Europe. He was Czech, but left Czechoslovakia to escape the 30 Years' War and moved around Europe, landed in Britain for a while, and then left shortly after the English Civil War broke out there. He lived in Belgium, Germany, and England, and studied with many naturalists and was hired by the Earl of Arundel to illustrate the Earl's collection of curiosities. But he was able to keep producing work for other naturalists. His seashell drawings are accurate and gorgeous. They were never published, and it's not known if they were commissioned by the Earl. It's thought that they were probably commissioned by a wealthy Dutch cloth merchant named Jan Volkerts, who wanted to catalog his shell collection. We will look at the shell craze. We talked about the tulip craze in the botany section. The northern regions of the Low Countries, Holland, Flanders, the Netherlands, Belgium, underwent a shell craze that rivaled the tulip craze. We call it concholomania. So conchology, which is the study of shells, developed into an independent field of research in the late 17th century, and the craze for collecting them began. By the 18th century, shell fever exceeded the tulip craze in Holland because of the influx of extraordinary specimens being brought back from Indonesia and beyond by the Dutch East India Company and by Captain Cook's expeditions to the South Seas. The price of shells exceeded their weight in gold, and collectors had special drawers built for their display that included individual compartments lined in silk and satin to contrast with their natural colors. By this point, several books on the do's and don'ts of collecting and displaying specimens, and of shells in particular, had been published. And we see them develop into a genre of still life painting in the Netherlands. These are the paintings of Adriaan Coort. His birth dates are not known. The city hall in his town burned down, and so records of his birth and death dates are lost. But we know he was active between 1683 and 1707. And we know that he was an apprentice of the painter Melchior Hondecoeter, whose work we'll look at in the ornithology section. Coort, this painter, was a member of the Guild of St. Luke. He began as a painter of birds and flowers, but later focused his attention on vanitas still lifes and then on seashells. So it was typical for a painter to specialize in a very specific genre, which he did. Even if that genre went out of fashion a few years later, then they would generally move to a new genre as they tried to find new clients. Coort lived in Middelburg, Zeeland, which is now the Netherlands, which was then a prosperous trading center, mostly because of the presence of the Dutch East and West India companies. And his work shows this period's love of seashells. What's unusual about these paintings is that they're created on paper, which was then mounted on panels. And this is probably done because it offered a smooth surface free of the irregularities that would be found in wood panels. He worked in a series of glazes, and the dark, dense backgrounds of his paintings give the shells an extra shine, a glow, and create an aura of mystery and of drama. We're looking here at Maria Marien's illustrations for the naturalist George Rumph, whose other name was Rumphius. It was common for naturalists to give themselves Latin names. George Rumph was born in 1628, by the way. So he took a position with the Dutch East India Company in 1652 and was stationed on Ambon Island in the Moluccas, which is now Indonesia. And it was there that he was able to pursue his interest in natural history, especially seashells. A series of tragedies came between him and the publishing of his books. He lost his sight at the age of 42, and then his wife and daughter died in an earthquake a couple of years ago. To make matters worse, his drawings and manuscripts were lost in transit to the publisher in Holland when the French army sank the boat that they were on. He rewrote his books on the natural history of Ambon Island and sent them yet again to the publisher, but they remained unpublished until a friend revived the project. And that friend hired Sibylla Merian to produce the seashell illustrations. Note again the reference to Durer's staghorn beetle, which we've seen now in multiple paintings and prints, especially in the botanical studies that we looked at a few weeks ago. Finally, 2 folios of his work were published, one that focused on animals and particularly on shells and crustaceans, called Damboinche Rarheitskammer, or the Cabinet of Curiosities of Ambon, and a second book on plants called Herbarium Ambionense, which is about the botanical studies of Ambon Island. Both were published after his death. These are the very imaginative but inaccurate drawings of Filippo Buonanni, born in 1638. Buonanni was a professor of philosophy at the Collegio Romano. His colleague, Athanasius Kircher, amassed a huge collection of natural curios. And after Kircher's death, Buonanni was hired to illustrate the catalog of the collection, even though he had no artistic training. So he copied this task. He completed this task by copying the works of others, by learning to draw from studying the works of others, and then borrowed heavily from popular images. We can see the obvious influence of Arcimboldo here. And this catalog of Kircher's collection was published with the Latinized title of Museum Kircherianum in 1709. These are the etchings of Martin Lister, born in 1639. Lister was a British naturalist and a member of the Royal Society of London who focused on spiders and shells. He published the first book on arachnids and published a 2-volume encyclopedia on shells called the Historiae Concoliorum in 1685, and then a second edition in 1692. He divided shells into 4 groups based on these traits. Monochromatic shells was the first group. Second is black streaked. Third is transversely waved. And fourth is winged or banded shells. He wasn't satisfied with the skills of the available contemporary illustrators, and so he taught his daughters Susanna and Anna how to illustrate the specimens he studied, and the 3 of them produced over 1,000 copperplate engravings of shells and mollusks collected around the world from his book. So this is one of the rare examples that we have of females involved in the illustration process, particularly in the illustrations that got published. This is the work of Louis Renard, born at the end of the 17th century. He was an engraver, publisher, and bookseller, and also the author and illustrator of fishes, crayfish, and crabs of various colors and extraordinary figures, which one finds around the Moluccas Islands and on the coast of the Austral lands. So a very long title. His engravings are based on the drawings of an artist named Samuel Fallours, who is a soldier in the Dutch East India Company, and also on the artist's work of Balthazar Coyet and Adrian van der Stel. So it's rare, as we've said, to get credit for the artist that created the original drawings. Renard based his engravings on their drawings, and then he enhanced and brightened the colors because he found their colors too dull. His descriptions included anecdotes and culinary suggestions about each fish. He was an eccentric man who claimed to be a British spy, but he was actually openly employed by the British Crown to inspect vessels leaving Amsterdam for smuggled weapons to prevent an overthrow of the throne of England. Despite the unbelievable shapes and colors and the folk art-like quality of these illustrations, only 1/10 of the images stem from the imagination, and the other 90% are considered accurate descriptions, even if not naturalistically portrayed. We're looking here at the cover and front piece of the book by Antoine Joseph Desailliers d'Argentville, born at the end of the 17th century in 1680. D'Argentville had a doctorate degree in law and studied literature, painting, drawing, engraving, art history, and gardening. He amassed a huge collection of paintings, drawings, and prints, and also of shells while working for the King of France in 1716. It was common practice to buy a position in the king's cabinet, which is what he did, and this gave him an honorary title and noble status. And then he paid his way up through the ranks of Louis XV. While working under the two kings, only while working under Louis XV, he established a large cabinet and library, and he became most famous for his gigantic shell collection and for his treatises on gardening and designing the perfect botanical garden. He also wrote a book on minerals and fossils. D'Argentville recognized the popularity of shells and went to Holland to purchase the rarest specimens for resale, and he organized auctions of Naturalia in Paris, which helped fuel this desire for shell collecting. Over the next 40 years, shells got the highest prices at these auctions of Naturalia. His book on conchology was published in 1742 and was extremely successful with the shell-obsessed public. Shells had been included in previous books on marine life, but his was the first to focus exclusively on shells. He used a mirror to draw the shells in reverse so that they would face the right direction when printed, because printing creates a mirror image. The side of the opening of the shell is crucial to identification, so it was a very important step to use the mirror so that they would be accurate when reproduced. He wrote detailed descriptions of their shapes, colors, patterns, and place of origin, and included instructions on cleaning, preserving, and then coating them in egg white for maximum shine. He also wrote about methods for arranging them either according to scientific classification or to arrange them aesthetically. He admonished those who went so far as to paint shells with enamel and buff them, which would make the colors appear natural, which was common practice at this time. He divided shells by their habitat of fluvial, marine, or terrestrial, and described a system for lay people to identify shells by family, genus, and species using the following steps. First step is to identify the number of parts, 1, 2, or more, something called a CAC univalve, a bivalve, or a multivalve. Then you would consider the overall shape, whether it's fluted or shaped, whether it's conical or spherical, and then to look at the shape of the aperture or the opening. Is it circular, oblong, flanged, or plane? And the final step would be to look for small differences within a family of shells, such as a rounded or pointed apex. His book provided illustrations to guide the reader through the taxonomic process, and he was part of a growing movement to educate the public on classifying and ordering their cabinets of collections. The expense of his book was partly covered by the collectors who had specimens from their collections illustrated and included a dedication to them in the book. He and his father produced the drawings which were used for the engravings based on the artwork of Aveline, and then hand-colored by professionals who specialized in the field of shells and fish. We're looking at a gorgeous study from his botanical book on arranging your garden. He wrote a treatise on the theory and practice of garden design and irrigation with his teacher, Jean-Baptiste Alexandre Leblond. This is the work of Marcus Eliezer Bloch, born in 1723. These are hand-colored etchings. Bloch was a German physician born to a poor family, and he received little education. He had some knowledge of Hebrew and rabbinical literature and was able to find a tutor's position in the home of a Jewish surgeon, which is where he learned to read German and to study anatomy, which led to an interest in natural history. He wrote many papers on natural history, on comparative anatomy and physiology, but is best known for his 12-volume encyclopedia on fishes, 3 of which focused on the fish of Germany. He followed the systematic arrangements of Linnaeus and Peter Artedi, but modified the classifications based on the structure of the gills, specifically the absence or presence of a 5th gill. And he added 19 new genera to the number previously established, and also described 176 previously unknown species, most of them from remote parts of the ocean. His books were published in 1784 and 1788. As previously mentioned, these were usually illustrated by several artists who did not receive credit and engraved by a few who did receive credit. We know that Ludwig Schmidt is the name of the person who produced many of the engravings. Because fish lose their colors so quickly once they die, the colors of the prints are not considered to be accurate. It's very hard to preserve fish and to keep their colors, so their shapes also change rapidly. So it can be quite difficult to identify a fish based on some of these drawings. Many of the images are based on specimens collected from around the globe, but some of them are composite images based on the available studies and writings of other artists. Bloch had about 1,500 specimens in his collection, most of which are now in the Natural History Museum of Humboldt University in Berlin. It's important to consider the influence of the desire for colonial expansion and the hunt for new resources of Europe into other parts of the world. So we're looking here at the portrait of Joseph Banks of the mid-18th century. Banks was a wealthy socialite interested in science, philosophy, and art who was born at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. New tools like the microscope and telescope were expanding the boundaries of the known universe. Banks shared his contemporaries' view that the world could be manipulated through advancements in technology and that everyone would benefit from the sharing of information needed to make these advancements. He was interested in all of the natural sciences, but especially in botany. Once he inherited his family fortune, he provided a lot of the financial support for voyages of exploration and discovery. He also served as advisor to the king and helped establish the Kew Gardens of England, which became a scientific hub. And he received specimens from voyages to Australia, Northwest America, Vancouver, Canada, Tahiti, and India. He wanted to help improve Britain's economic standing during this period of expanding trade, and he was interested in the European competition for colonial territory. He also wanted to help establish production of materials that could be exported from the colonies back to Britain, which included things like indigo, cocoa, vanilla, cotton, and cochineal, which is used in dyes, red dyes. He was involved in sending Captain Bligh to Tahiti to obtain breadfruit and other plants that could be cultivated in the Caribbean to feed the slaves of the sugar plantations. And it was Banks that suggested establishing a colony for British convicts in Australia. He made 3 voyages to collect and identify plants and animals, including one on the Endeavour with Captain James Cook, which we'll discuss next. Banks donated more of the funding to this voyage even than King George III did. This voyage was supposedly to observe the transit of Venus across the sun in order to improve navigation and maps and to put Britain at an advantage. But it was also to try to find this great southern continent, which was believed to exist in the South Pacific. We're looking here at the roots of the Endeavour under Captain James Cook. Cook was born in 1728 and died in 1779, so shortly after the American Revolution began. Cook began his career as an apprentice on a merchant navy ship and dedicated himself to the study of algebra, geometry, trigonometry, navigation, and astronomy, all of which were necessary skills in becoming a sea captain. He was best known for these voyages that he made to the Pacific Ocean and to Australia between 1768 and 1779. As I said, the stated mission of the Endeavour voyage was to observe the transit of Venus, but in fact, they were searching for this land in the South Pacific. They stopped in the Madeira Islands and Tahiti on the way to gather supplies and to collect specimens, and picked up a Tahitian navigator and translator named Tupaya, who joined them willingly. He helps them chart the territory and identify unfamiliar species. Only after the celestial observations were made could Cook reveal the orders from the Admiralty to the crew to find and lay claim to the Terra Australis Incognita, as it was called, which was a partially charted landmass believed to cover much of the southern hemisphere. The directions which he revealed to the Admiralty, the directions which he revealed from the Admiralty to the crew were as follows. You are to observe the genius, temper, disposition, and number of the natives, if there be any, and endeavor by all proper means to cultivate a friendship and alliance with them, making them presents of such trifles as they may value, inviting them to traffic, and showing them every kind of civility and regard, taking care, however, not to suffer yourself to be surprised by them, but to be always upon your guard against any accidents. You are also, with the consent of the natives, to take possession of convenient situations in the country in the name of the King of Great Britain, or if you find the country uninhabited, take possession for His Majesty by setting up proper marks and inscriptions as first discoverers and possessors. You are also to carefully observe the nature of the soil and the products thereof, the beasts and fowls that inhabit or frequent it, the fishes that are to be found in the rivers or upon the coast, and in what plenty, and in case you find any mines, minerals, or valuable stones, you are to bring home specimens of each, as also such specimens of the seeds of the trees, fruits, and grains, as you may be able to collect, and transmit them to our secretary, that we may cause proper examination and experiments to be made of them. His was the first recorded contact between Europeans and those living on the eastern coastline of Australia. The Endeavour made landfall in what would be called Botany Bay after the flora collected by the ship's botanists, which were Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander. They returned with over 1,000 unknown species, including many orchids. Banks and Solander directed the work of several artists that accompanied the ship to document these findings. So we have the names of the artists on the voyage, though we don't always have identification of their names to the work they created. The artists were Alexander Buchan, Sidney Parkinson, Herman Sporing, John Miller, John Cleveley, and Frederick Nodder. These voyages entailed sailing thousands of miles across uncharted areas of the globe. He surveyed and named land features. This is still Cook that we're talking about, and recorded islands and coastlines from New Zealand to Hawaii, demonstrating his skills in surveying and cartography, in seamanship, and in his ability to lead. The naturalists on his expeditions collected shells, and so did the crew. When they returned to Europe, they discovered that there was a huge market for exotic shells, and this frenzy of buying shells from the South Seas began. The illustrations of these shells were compiled in the Neue Systematische Concilion Cabinet, published in 1768 and through multiple editions through 1829. We have an 11-volume series here on shells, started by Frederick Wilhelm Martini, and then continued by Johann Hieronymus Chemnitz after Martini's death in 1778. It featured a large number of Cook specimens and was illustrated by multiple artists and printmakers. Cook was killed on his third voyage while trying to detain the ruler of a Hawaiian island. He'd been holding the ruler in an attempt to get a cutter ship taken from his own ship after his crew took precious wood from a Hawaiian burial ground. And so in detaining the ruler of Hawaii, he was murdered. This brings us to the work of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, born in 1744, and he lived until 1829. Lamarck became interested in natural history while stationed in Monaco with the French military. He retired from the army to pursue the study of nature and published 3 volumes on the flora of France, which earned him a membership in the Academy of Sciences. He then became professor of zoology at the Natural History Museum, where he studied invertebrates. Through the study of mollusks, he observed that a species can change over time and developed his theory on acquired characteristics, though this was not a new concept. His ideas on evolution were a little different from Darwin's. In 1801, he published a large work on the classification of invertebrates called Système des animaux sans vertébrés, and was the first to separate spiders from insects in the classification system and to put crustaceans in a separate class. These are 2 of the more popular images of natural history. We see them printed on everything from rum bottles to tchotchkes of every kind. They're taken from the art of Pierre Denis de Montfort, born in 1766. Montfort was a French naturalist who specialized in invertebrates, and he was especially interested in confirming the existence of a giant octopi, which this insistence led to his downfall. He wrote and illustrated several books on the natural history of mollusks and invertebrates, which were published as an addendum to the Count de Buffon's natural history books. We spoke about Louis Leclerc, also known as the Count de Buffon, in the zoology section a week or 2 ago. Buffon included Montfort's writings at the end of his book when it was reprinted. Upon learning of a 25-foot tentacle said to be found in the mouth of a sperm whale, Montfort pursued this question of the existence of a giant octopi. It's believed that the sightings of this giant squid, which can reach a length of up to 50 feet, inspired the Norse legends of the kraken, or sea monster, said to be living between Norway and Greenland. When 10 British ships disappeared overnight in 1782, Montfort proposed that they'd been brought down by the giant octopi, but the British military knew the actual reason, and he was publicly ridiculed to the point where he was no longer believed as a naturalist, and his career came to a grinding halt. This is the work of Wilhelm Gottlieb Tilesius von Tillenau, born in 1769. Von Tillenau was a German physician, naturalist, and explorer, as well as a skilled draftsman and engraver. He participated in the Russian circumnavigation of the globe with 2 other naturalists in 1803 until 1806 and collected plants and more. The main purpose of the voyage was to visit Russian possessions on the northwest coast of America and to open up commercial trade with Japan, but they also collected and observed nature. They stopped in the Canary Islands, Brazil, Cape Horn, Macau, China, and Japan. He studied natural science and medicine and then traveled with the scientist J.C. Hofmannsegg to Portugal to study zoology and practice local medicine. He created an illustrated report of the expedition, and his botanical collections ended up in the Botanical Garden of St. Petersburg. While in Russia, von Tillenau reconstructed a woolly mammoth skeleton excavated from the Siberian permafrost, though he did not travel himself to Siberia. He returned to Germany in 1814 and published several papers on fish, whales, and invertebrates, including one called The Directory and Classification of Strange Sea Creatures. So we see images here of life at sea, of the fishermen, and of the fish all combined. I'm including here the work of one of the few females, again, that studied shells and was respected as a scientist. Sister showed skills in drawing while in grade school in Philadelphia, and so was guided towards illustrating nature by her teacher. She received some training from Audubon and from another artist and naturalist named Charles Lesueur, and then married the entomologist Thomas Say. She was one of the few women to be an elected member of the Academy of Natural Sciences in the Department of Conchology. And then she and her husband moved to a utopian community called New Harmony in Indiana. She wrote a book on American conchology and produced 66 out of the 68 engravings. We're looking here at the color lithographs, also known as chromolithography, of Philip Henry Goss, born in 1810. Goss began his interest in nature with the study of insects as a child. His parents couldn't afford to send him to upper school, so he found a job as a clerk with a law firm that dealt in the seal and fish trades. He was then transferred to Newfoundland, and after several years decided to make his way south. He stopped in Philadelphia first, then went to Alabama to collect fossils, and then went back to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. He'd learned to paint miniatures from his father, who painted miniatures for a living, and then began painting them himself. He also created watercolor studies of plants and insects in Newfoundland when he returned to the north. While down in Alabama, he found work tutoring the children of a plantation owner, and this gave him the time to collect fossils and study local flora and fauna. When he returned to England, he became especially interested in marine invertebrates and developed an indoor aquarium, inspired by the popular glassed-in terrariums that were so popular in Victorian England. He filled his tank with salt water and then added anemones so that he could observe and illustrate them. And from this, he developed the first public aquarium for the London Zoo in 1852 and established this trend of keeping living aquaria in the home. He also published a manual called The Aquarium, an unveiling of the wonders of the deep sea in 1854. He wrote over 40 books and hundreds of articles about science for the general population, all of which were influenced by his deeply held religious beliefs. He included an argument in favor of the biblical account of creation, and it was also written in response to new theories being published by Charles Darwin, Alfred Wallace, the geologist Charles Lyell, and others. In 1860, he published Actinologia Britannica, a history of the British sea anemones and corals, which he illustrated from the observation based on species that he placed in his tanks. This is the work of William Savile Kent, born in 1845. These illustrations are based on the original watercolors by Kent, and the lithographs were produced by two other artists named Mr. Couchman and Mr. Riddle, of which little is known. Kent was mentored by the comparative anatomist T.H. Huxley and began his career working for the British Museum as a curator of coral, but he became bored in the administration and wanted to conduct research. He received a grant from the Royal Society to oversee the dredging of the coast off Portugal, which led to his interest in aquaculture and to his recognition of the potential for experimental marine biology at public aquaria. He was recruited by the Tasmanian government of Australia based on his work for the Great International Fisheries Exhibition, which was held in London at the late 19th century. And so went to Tasmania, where he produced a comprehensive study of Australian fisheries that included biological, economic, and commercial aspects, as well as including fishery laws. He then worked for several Australian states to improve fishery practices And it was there that he studied fish, corals, sponges, turtles, sea cucumbers, and a sea mammal called a dugong. He was taken with the beauty and life of the great coral reef and was recognizing and concerned by the human-caused damage to the reef. Upon returning to England, he worked for the Lever Brothers Company on experimenting with cultured pearls and managed to produce both blister and spherical pearls with enormous commercial value. He photographed corals and tidal pools and created a second book, which included photographs and color lithographs based on his drawings. His books included a manual of the infusoria and a book on the Great Barrier Reef, as well as a third book called The Naturalist in Australia. And finally, we come to the work of Ernst Hagel, born in 1834, and he died in 1919. Hagel was a German biologist and professor whose discoveries and writings supported Darwin's recently published theory of evolution. He traveled with his professor, Johannes Müller, to the Heligoland archipelago off the coast of Germany in the North Sea to study marine life. He then traveled to Italy, where he continued drawing from observation. While in Italy, he began examining the complex structure of radiolarians under the microscope and illustrated their intricate mineral skeletons and recognized similar formations in crystals. He also traveled to Ceylon in India to study local flora and fauna. Unfortunately, Hagel was also a eugenicist, so he was a proponent of selective reproduction that aimed to eliminate populations that he or other eugenicists deemed undesirable. So this could include people with mental or physical handicaps, criminal backgrounds, or minorities. They were proponents of forced sterilization. The obvious problem with the concept of eugenics is that the party in power determines who has the right to reproduce. Like many Europeans of the era, he used Darwin's theory of natural selection to support racism. There began a philosophical movement that proposed that people of different races had different biological progressions by nature, and that the white race possessed greater intellect. These faux scientific ideas provided the basis for the eugenics movement in the US, which is where it is said to have originated, and in Europe, and then were used by the Nazis to justify the genocide of Jews and of the sick and disabled. He created a genealogical tree that connected all life forms and illustrated these in his book, The General Morphology of Organisms, published in 1866, 1 year after Darwin's theory of evolution was published. He stated that the diversity of living things follows a line of descent originating in a simple primordial form, and named thousands of new species. He coined several biological terms, including ecology, phylum, phylogeny, and protista. His second book, Art Forms in Nature, focused mostly on microscopic organisms and demonstrated radial and stereosymmetry. It also included jellyfish and sea urchins, some houseplants, mammals, and birds. His illustrations showed the similarities between animal horns and snails. His work was wildly popular, as it still is today, though little know of his disturbing beliefs. And he quickly became one of the most popular illustrators in the nature genre. He's also said to have inspired artists of the Art Nouveau movement who applied the use of symmetry and geometry to their botanical themes. So we will end with this extraordinary work of a complicated man, and then we'll talk about your assignment for this week.